Well, okay, by this point you know the score. We have been walking through the New Hampshire Confession of Faith. That is a very old Baptist doctrinal statement from the 1800s, and we've been trekking through each of the passages of Scripture that it cites as a way to wrap our heads around how the Scriptures speak into our lives. And so right now we're in a section of the New Hampshire Confession called Of Baptism and the Lord's Supper. So we're looking at passages that teach us about baptism and the Lord's Supper. What is baptism? Why does it exist? What does it mean? What are we doing when we get baptized? What is God telling us through baptism? And what are we telling the world through our baptisms? We'll get into the Lord's Supper just a few weeks from now, but right now we're zeroing in on baptism. We are looking at the biblical view of baptism. What we find is that baptism is not just a kind of ritual that you go through when you're 7 or so because you heard the gospel presented at a vacation Bible school and then you got it out of the way as a rite of passage, kind of like going to prom. Right? Baptism is not just a ritual. It's not just super religious prom. Baptism means something. Baptism is something. Baptism is a living sermon. It's a visual metaphor. It's a walking symbol for the deepest truths of our faith. And so we've been very slowly going through the passages in the Bible that touch on baptism. We've been taking them apart, holding every piece up to the light, and then putting them back together, hopefully coming out of it with a deeper, richer, more nourishing, more edifying, more soul-sustaining understanding of what our own baptism meant. And so let's take a look at this week's passage, Romans chapter 6, verses 3 through 5. Once again, that's Romans chapter 6, verses 3 through 5. Now, can everybody see the board okay? All right, it's not a bad angle for anybody? Okay. Can anybody read Romans 6, verses 3 through 5? Both Dave Fitch and Connie Waters are barred from reading this week.
Or do you not know that as many of us were baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Therefore we were buried with him through baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. For if we have been united together in the likeness of his death, certainly we also shall be in the likeness of his resurrection.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Very good. As always, I'm going to read that to you one last time, just to kind of burn it into your memories. We were talking yesterday at the Tuesday Bible study about how a long, long time ago in the early church and in the Jewish community, way back in the day, they would repeat things again and again and again in a way that just absolutely brands it on your brain so that you would never forget it again. I'm going to annoyingly burn this passage into your memory, just like we do every week. And so Romans 6, 3 through 5, Paul says, "Are you unaware that all of us who were baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Therefore we were buried with him by baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too may walk in a new way of life. For if we have been joined with him in the likeness of his death, we will certainly also be in the likeness of his resurrection." That's Romans 6, 3 through 5. So as always, we want to ask 5 questions. What does this passage teach us about God? What does this passage teach us about humanity? Is there a sin to avoid or a promise to claim in this passage? Is there a command to be obeyed or an example to be followed in this passage? And how will your life change now that you have read and wrestled with this passage? So let's start with the first question. What does Romans 6, 3 through 5 tell you about God?
He was raised from the dead.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Jesus was raised from the dead. Jesus was raised from the dead. There was I think it was like a Gallup poll not long ago. That's one of those companies that they put out a whole bunch of polls. I don't actually know who they talked to because they never talked to me. So, I don't know who the people are that they're talking to, but there was a recent Gallup poll and it was on religious knowledge among the American public, something like that. It had a social sciencey kind of name, the poll did, but one of the things it found was that something like 70% of Americans are familiar with the crucifixion of Jesus, but only something like 53% of Americans are familiar with the resurrection of Jesus. So most Americans are aware that Jesus died on the cross. They know that part of the story. That makes sense because you see a crucifix or something like that. If you ever walk by like a Catholic church, almost all of them have a crucifix on the top, and so you can see Jesus on the cross. So most people are familiar with Jesus on the cross. Most people are not familiar with Jesus off the cross, right? Most people are not familiar with Jesus outside the tomb. Most people are not familiar with the reality of the resurrection of Jesus. Now, that's a pretty stark statistic, right? I just told you that a little under half of Americans know about the resurrection of Jesus. That's a pretty hardcore statistic, right? And yet, step into a church, step into the average evangelical church, maybe even the average Southern Baptist church, there's a good chance you'll hear a whole lot about the crucifixion there too. You should. One hopes, right? Hopefully, if you walk into a church, you'll hear about the crucifixion of Jesus. Hopefully, you'll hear about the cross. But walk into the average Southern Baptist church, even if you hear about the crucifixion of Jesus, you're quite a bit less likely to hear about the resurrection of Jesus. Know what I'm talking about? I can remember growing up, and part of this was a me problem. I wasn't the most attentive little dude, but I can remember growing up, and I don't know how old I was when this finally clicked, but for the longest time as a kid, I'd go to church on Easter or something like that. I would go to church any of the Sundays when you typically hear a lot about the resurrection of Jesus, and the question I always had was like, what's the point? I never understood what the point of the resurrection of Jesus was. You know what I'm talking about? I basically got the point of the cross. I paid enough attention to know the pastor always said, Jesus died on the cross, therefore you're forgiven, or something like that. I could track with that, but I didn't get what the point of the resurrection was. If Jesus has already accomplished our forgiveness through the cross, who cares if he rose up, right? I never got the point of the resurrection. Part of the reason for that being that in the average Southern Baptist church, we rarely talk about the point of the resurrection, don't we? More than that, we rarely talk about the resurrection in general. If you hear about the resurrection of Jesus at all, it's usually in the context of somebody saying, we can prove that Jesus was resurrected, and the resurrection of Jesus proves that he was God, or something like that. You know what I'm talking about? If we hear about the resurrection at all, it's always in the context of the resurrection happened, and I can prove it. Or the resurrection happened, and that proves the Bible, or something like that. What we almost never hear is the resurrection happened. Here's why. Right? We ignore the resurrection almost as a matter of course. And yet, if you trek through the New Testament, If you watch the Let's Read Scripture Together videos that I made for a year and a half after the pandemic started, we went all the way through the New Testament a couple times. One of the things you probably noticed during that time is that the New Testament, so Paul, Peter, James, Jude, whoever wrote Hebrews, they talk about the resurrection of Jesus constantly. Like, they were obsessed with the resurrection of Jesus. Like, it's not a competition. You don't pit the cross and the resurrection against each other, but they talk way more about the resurrection of Jesus than they do about the cross. Why is that? I can tell you why. It's because the cross of Jesus Christ doesn't mean anything without the resurrection of Jesus Christ. When I was a kid and I said, okay, Jesus died on the cross to save me or something, so who cares about the resurrection? I was as wrong as I could possibly be. The resurrection is the point. The cross is how I get there. The resurrection is the event. The cross is how we get there. The resurrection is the central point of history. The resurrection is the turning point of your life. The resurrection is the central reality of your existence. I know we're getting abstract here, but bear with me. The cross is the front porch of that. We have a resurrection faith. Because in the resurrection of Jesus, it's not just the story of a guy who was dead coming back to life. The resurrection of Jesus is the story of a guy who was dead bringing you back to life. The story of the resurrection is the story of Jesus bringing you back to life. And so, Jesus was raised from the dead. I'm really glad that that's the first thing that we happened on this evening, because most of the time, in most church settings, this is an afterthought. Jesus was raised from the dead. And our baptism is about the fact that Jesus was raised from the dead. So you'll notice one thing. Every time we do a baptism, the pastor grabs whoever they're baptizing. I mean, that sounds more like violent than it is, but you know. Somebody comes up to get baptized. And the pastor welcomes the person who's getting baptized. And they go up to the water. And the first thing they do is they put them under the water, right? Now, they don't hold them under the water as long as I've held this pause, because they would die. But you put them under the water, and that symbolizes the fact that Jesus went into the grave, right? You're buried with Jesus in baptism. But then the next thing Paul says is, and you're raised with him to walk in newness of life. You're raised with Jesus into a new life. Paul talks about that same thing in Colossians chapter 3. He says, if then you have been raised with the Messiah, then set your mind on the things above. Remember that one? He says the same thing in the Galatians passage from last week. He says, I have died with Christ, and now it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. He says, I died with Christ on the cross, but in exactly the same way that I died with Christ on the cross, I was raised with Christ on the cross. Baptism is about the fact that we have been raised with Jesus. It's about the fact that even though we were crucified with Jesus, now we've been raised with Jesus. And everything about our life is different because of it. Like once upon a time, we were far from God, right? Once upon a time, you and God were not friends. We talked about that the last couple weeks too. Remember last week we talked about how God becomes your father through faith, right? Once you were a child of wrath, Ephesians chapter 2 says. Once, John chapter 8 says you were a child of the devil. That sounds melodramatic, but it makes sense when you really get into it, right? And yet now, you're a child of God. Now, because you've been crucified with Jesus, because your sin was nailed with Jesus to the cross, because your sin was buried with Jesus into the grave, now you've been raised with Jesus, no longer as a condemned sinner, no longer as a child of wrath, no longer as a child of the devil, no longer as someone who's far from God. You've been raised up with Jesus into a new life. And in that new life, now you're loved by God. In this new life that you've been raised into, you're cherished by God. In this new life that you're raised into, you're accepted by God. You're embraced by God. You're adopted by God. It's like you went into the ground, a sinner condemned. You came out of the ground with Jesus, redeemed and embraced. And so Jesus was raised from the dead, and that is more important than we could possibly imagine. And when we are baptized, what we're saying is, I have been raised up with Jesus. When you were baptized, what you're saying is, I have been raised up from the grave with Jesus. You're saying, I have been raised up no longer condemned, but embraced, adopted, beloved. That's what your baptism is about. So is there anything else that Romans 6, 3 through 5 tells us about God? Is there anything that you see in our passage about humanity? What does Romans 6, 3 through 5 tell you about humanity? Very good point.
We were buried with him by baptism.
That's right, yeah. So we are buried with Jesus in baptism. That's exactly right. We are buried with Jesus in baptism. Maybe you've never thought about it this way before, but your baptism is a funeral service. Your baptism is your funeral service. When we gather together to baptize somebody, we're laying them down to rest. We're performing their funeral. Just a few weeks ago when we baptized Jaden, we were burying him. We were putting him in the ground. We were performing his funeral. We were eulogizing the old Jathan, because the old Jathan is dead. The Jathan who was condemned by God is dead now. The Jathan who was locked out of God's kingdom is gone. The Jathan who was estranged from the God who created him doesn't exist anymore. That Jathan is over. There's a new Jathan. There's a new Jathan that, like we just talked about, has been raised up with Jesus. This is why the funeral services that we do at Mount Zion are the way they are. It's because the people that we're burying didn't actually die. The people that we're burying have been dead for a long time. David Batten didn't die in November of 2020. David Batten died decades ago. Ricky Powell didn't die back in September of 2020. Ricky Powell died a very long time ago. If my family friend Dudley, who's currently having a hard time with COVID, if he really is at death's door and he passes away in the near future, so my old pastor from back in Texas has to do his funeral sometime soon, that'll be rough. And yet the reality will be that Dudley's funeral service was decades ago at his baptism, because Dudley's death was decades ago at his baptism. Because one of the things that happens when we're nailed to the cross with Jesus, like Colossians chapter 2 says, when Jesus takes our record of debt and he sets it aside by nailing it to the cross, one of the things that happens when we are put to death with Jesus, like Paul says, is that death is put to death with Jesus. Our temporariness is put to death with Jesus. Our expiration date is put to death with Jesus. When we're buried with Christ and then we're raised back up with him, he makes us permanent in a way that we didn't used to be. He makes us forever in a way we didn't used to be. He makes you eternal in a way that you did not used to be. He takes the sting away from death. That's the way Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, "O death, where is your sting? O hell, where is your victory?" And so we cried when David Batten died. We cried when Ricky Powell died. We cried when each of our loved ones died. When we lost Deborah Moore, when we lost Megan's dad. It was horrific. We grieved. It was traumatic. But that trauma, that grief, that was temporary. Even if we carry that grief for the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, however long we have left, that grief still, that was temporary. Because Christ has made it temporary. Because Christ has made us permanent. And so death has lost its sting because we're going to see Lynn Hyde again. Death has lost its sting because we're going to see Annie Gupton again. Death has lost its sting because I'm going to get to meet Ronald Murphy one day. I didn't get to the first time around. I'm going to get to.
You really missed something.
Yeah. There you go. But I'm going to get to the second time around. Because we've been buried with Jesus in baptism, and being buried with Jesus nullifies your funeral. And so the part where you die tragically here in this life, that sucks. But that's a rite of passage. The part where you die here in this life, that's the thing that's like prom. Baptism isn't like prom. Dying is like prom. Also, I thought my senior prom was kind of like dying. Didn't enjoy it. But dying here now, it's a formality. Like taxes. Like paying your parking ticket. It sucks more than those things, but you get the point. Because Christ has made us permanent. Ironically, he's made us permanent by burying us with himself and then raising us up together with him. And just like Jesus came out of the grave with a glorified body that would never decay, that would never die, that would never go away, when Jesus raises us up now, we are eternal with him. We're going to die, but then we're going to undie. And we're going to come back up. And every tear we've ever cried throughout all of time is going to be wiped away. Revelation 22 says, and then every sad thing, every tragic thing, every horrific sadness we've ever encountered is going to become untrue. Isaiah 65 says, we've been buried with Jesus, raised up with him. And so Christ has made us permanent. He has undone our temporariness. He has taken the sting away from death. And when we are baptized, what we're saying is, Christ has done this to me. When we're baptized, we're saying, these things have happened to me. When we're baptized, we're preaching a physical sermon, so to speak. We're preaching a sermon without words about this, about the fact that we have been buried and raised with Jesus. So that's good. We are buried with Jesus in baptism. Is there anything else we see about humanity here in Romans 6, 3 through 5? You see a sin to avoid or a promise to claim?
You know, the promise is that we're going to be given that new life through Christ.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a new life through Christ. So I should have written that a little differently. I should have said we have the new life through Christ. When I say we have a new life through Christ, that sounds uplifting, but it's a little vague. When I say we have the new life through Christ, it's a little clearer that I'm talking about something specific. We have the new life through Christ. A little while ago, I was downtown Lewisburg, and I was walking through, and I was handing out flyers to Mount Zion, and I was talking to people, and I sat down with this guy. He was drinking one of those, like the 20-ounce cans of Bud Light. You know, you get them at the grocery store. So he had like a couple of those, And I was like, hey, can I come talk to you? And he was like, yeah, come on over. And he was like, you want one of these? And I very Baptistly declined it. And he was like, what's going on? And I was like, hey, I'm the pastor of Mount Zion Baptist Church. I'm coming through the neighborhood just talking to everybody and praying with everybody who either answers the door or is unlucky enough to get caught by me in the street. And he was like, well, yeah, we can do that. And so I talked to him a little bit, saw how I could pray for him. He told me a little bit of his life story and stuff like that. And I said, if you don't mind me asking, what do you believe? Do you have any religious beliefs or convictions? And he told me the story about how he grew up in a family of ministers. His dad was a minister. Most of his brothers are all ministers. He's really the one who didn't. He's the kind of the black sheep of his family. And I was like, okay, well that's a good start. That's awesome. And so I was like, what do you believe? About Jesus. And he said, oh well, Jesus is, I know that Jesus is he's like God's guy. And I was like, that a version of that is true, yeah. And he was like, I just try to be good every day. I try to be as good of a guy as I can because, I know one day I'm gonna have to stand before God, and so I really want, I want my good works to outweigh my bad. And I was like, oh, okay. So is that what you grew up hearing? And he was like, yeah. My dad always said, you got to be good because God's gonna count them up one day. And I was like, okay, well, cool. And so I opened up the little Mount Zion flyer, and it has the Roman road on it. And I was like, let me walk you through a couple of things that we believe. And so I walked him through Romans 1:20, that God created us and something in us knows that. And then Romans 3:23, that all of us have fallen short of the goodness that God created us for. And then Romans 6:23, that the wages of our sin is death. It's eternal separation from God. But the good news, Romans 5:8, is that even while we were still sinners, even while we were still condemned, Christ died to save us from our sin, to save us from that death. And therefore, Romans chapter 10, verse 9, if you throw yourself on the mercy of Jesus, you will be saved. And I walked through that with him, and it was kind of like when you throw a tennis ball at a brick wall, and it just kind of comes right back at you. It just didn't really click. He didn't really get it. He was like, yeah, that's awesome. I agree with all of that. And so I was like, well, so if you died tonight, I hate this, honestly. I really hate this, but sometimes this is what you got to say to kind of get the conversation going. I was like, so if you died tonight, do you believe you'd go to heaven, or do you believe you'd go to hell? He was like, well, I think I'd go to hell. And I was like, okay, I appreciate the honesty, Most people just assume they're going to heaven, They're like, I punched every wife I ever had, but I mean well, so I'm probably going to heaven, But I was like, I just appreciate that you got the gall to recognize that you may be going to hell. And so I was like, well, why do you think that? Tell me a little about that. And he told me a little more about his life, some of the things he's been through, some of the things he's done. Killed a dude in a bar fight, has a court date coming up. And I was like, all right, okay. That is a thing, yeah. Anyways, but so we kept walking. We kept kind of walking through this, and it just still wasn't clicking. And so I said, let me put it this way. Think about it this way. Imagine that you're on the run from the law. Well, you don't have to imagine. But imagine that you go to sleep one night and you have a dream about Jesus, and he's holding his hand out to you. And he says, take my hand, it's going to be okay. And so you take his hand. And when your hand touches his hand, you wake up. But when you wake up, you're not in your bed. And you're not wearing your clothes. And you look in the mirror and you're not you. You're somebody else. And you go outside and you realize that the different person that you woke up as, this person's like the golden child of his family. He's like his father's favorite son. He's the employee of the month. He's the citizen of the year. Later tonight, they're having a ceremony. They're going to give him a key to the city. You went to sleep on the run from the law, but you woke up in exactly the opposite situation. This is how it works when Jesus saves you. It's less dumb than the example I just gave, but when Jesus saves you, he puts to death the old you. He puts to death the punishment that was coming to the old you. He puts to death the condemnation that the old you had earned. He puts to death the wrath that was hanging over the old you. And instead, he raises up a new you. And the new you is no longer condemned, no longer under wrath. The new you instead has God's favor. Instead, the new you has God's adoration. Instead of being alienated from God, the new you is wrapped up in the embrace of God. Instead of being locked outside of God's gates, the new you is sitting at God's table as God's guest of honor. The new you is God's beloved son instead of God's rejected enemy. So if you throw yourself on the mercy of Jesus, in an instant you go from that first guy to that second guy. You wake up as a new person with a new standing, with a new status, with a new relationship to God. I don't know what's going to happen at your court date, but if you throw yourself on the mercy of God, I know what's going to happen at your last court date, when God raises us all up and judges us for our sins. If you throw yourself on the mercy of Jesus, you don't have to wonder where you're going when you die. You don't have to walk around assuming it's probably going to be hell. If you throw yourself on the mercy of Jesus, you can be assured that when you die, you're going to heaven. I don't know what your dad told you when you were younger, but I know what the Bible tells you now. And it's that if you throw yourself on the mercy of Jesus, Jesus will save you. We talked a little more. Haven't seen him since. I've gone back to his apartment a few times just to see if I could catch him. I've never been able to follow up with him, but that's the way I explained that to him. The reason I go through that whole story is because the promise of our passage here this evening is that we have the new life through Jesus. For years we had an old life. For years we were that guy waiting for his court date because he killed a dude in a bar fight on accident. But now we have the new life through Jesus. It's a dumb example, but now we're that dude getting the key to the city. Now we're the employee of the month. Now we're our Father's favored child instead of that guy on the run from the law. There's nothing you do that makes that true. There's nothing you do that changes you from that first guy to the second guy. You go from being that person on the run from the law to being that person getting the key to the city because of something Jesus does to you. He gives you the new life. He gives you a new life. He gives it to you from the outside. All you do is accept it. All you do is receive it. All you do is reach out and take it. and rest in it and be comforted by it and have peace in it. Your whole part in all of this is just to reach out and accept the new life that Jesus gives you. And then wake up as a new person with a new standing in a new relationship with God. That's the promise of our passage this evening. Jesus gives you the new life. And you knew that it was going here. This is what our baptism is about. When we are baptized, we're saying, once upon a time, I was that guy on the run from the law, but then I had that dream, and Jesus took my hand, and I woke up as that guy getting the key to the city. When we are baptized, we're saying, Jesus has given me a new life through his death and resurrection in my place. And so now I have that new life. Now I've been given that new life. Now I can rest in that new life. Now I am content in that new life. Now I have been, I don't even know what the word that I'm looking for is. Now my fears and my anxieties and my terror about what's going to happen to me when I die, all those things have been pacified and satisfied in that new life. Now all of my worry about whether I'm good enough has been put to rest because of this new life. Because not only am I no longer condemned in a spiritual sense, no longer am I not afraid of the afterlife, but now the weight of being good enough has been lifted off of me in this life. Because I know I'm not good enough. I can't be good enough. But I don't need to be good enough. Because Jesus has been good enough for me. And even though in my old life I was always trying and failing and falling into despair over whether I was good enough, now in my new life, I can just rest in the fact that Jesus has satisfied the need to be good enough in my place. So that's not hanging over me anymore. Now I just am who I am. I strive after holiness. I pursue God's will in everything I do. I try with everything in myself to live the way that God has called us to treat other people the way that God has directed us to. And yet, even as I fail constantly, I know that my failures have been forgiven. They've been covered. They've been taken care of. And so my failure doesn't condemn me. My failures just motivate me to do better tomorrow. I've been given a new life through Jesus. Is there a command to be obeyed or an example to be followed in our passage this evening? I traded in my old loud water bottle for a different loud water bottle. So is there a command to be obeyed or an example to be followed? Remember, it can be explicit, as in Paul can spell it out, or it can be implicit, as in you read this and it's clear that therefore we should do this. Is there a command to be obeyed or an example to be followed?
raised from the dead,
Mhm.
through Christ and through God, then we should, be baptized
Yeah,
in the likeness of his death.
that's good. Yeah. Yeah, so get baptized. You're exactly right. So just as Jesus was buried and raised, in the same way we're called to be buried in baptism and raised in baptism. One thing I hear a lot from like friends of mine who are like Catholic or Presbyterian, other denominations who believe in something called baptismal regeneration. That's a long story, but basically they teach that baptism actually has something to do with saving you. They don't say that baptism saves you. That's a common myth. No Christian really says that baptism saves you, but they say that baptism has something to do with saving you. That in some way the salvation that Jesus gives you is in some way given to you through baptism. That's what a lot of other denominations say. We disagree with that. We say that baptism does not save you and baptism has nothing to do with saving you. We say that baptism is what you do because you are saved. And so a lot of my friends from some of those other denominations that teach baptismal regeneration will say, okay, well look, like if baptism doesn't actually do anything to save you, what's the point of doing it? And I'm always kind of dumbfounded by the question, because I'm like, well, here's the thing. If God tells you to do something, you're supposed to do it. And they're always like, yeah, good point. But yeah, just as Jesus was buried and then raised, now we're called to be buried in baptism and then raised up in baptism. Maybe this seems painfully obvious, but all these passages we've been talking about that tell us what baptism means, why baptism exists, what baptism communicates, the constant kind of background refrain, the constant kind of silent, like it's in parentheses in the background. The call in each of these passages is do this. If you haven't been baptized, if you haven't publicly made this statement, if you haven't publicly delivered this visual sermon of Jesus burying and raising you, of Jesus redeeming you, of Jesus transforming you, if you haven't given this visual sermon by obediently taking up baptism, you need to.
What do you say to children? Because I got baptized when I was young.
Sure.
And, you know, in that moment,
Mm-hmm.
I thought I was doing, you know, changing my life. But there's sometimes when I think I should be baptized again. And, you know, like Tucker's talked to me about it, Parker's talked to me about it, but I haven't pushed it because I want it to be a true, I don't want to scare them into it. I want them to do it because they realize, but how do you make a kid realize? You know, so in their kid mind, they could probably understand what I did when I got baptized when I was like 7, you know.
Sure. Yeah, so I think that people who got baptized when they were really young and then maybe kind of went off their own way for a while, but then came back, I think that's a case-by-case thing. In most cases, here's what I think. I think if you got baptized when you were really young, maybe a little too young to totally understand what you were doing. Because, I mean, we're dropping some heavy stuff here. Not every 7-year-old is going to be like, yes, so we are buried with, you know, they're not going to be able to explain all the doctrinal ins and outs of baptism. That's fine. But I think that if you get baptized when you're really young, after having made a profession of faith, and then you maybe go your own way for a while, but then you eventually come back. I think the fact that you eventually came back is evidence that your conversion was genuine when you were younger. I think that if you go away and come back, I think that's probably evidence that your conversion was genuine when you were younger. I think a lot of the people who were baptized when they were 7 and then went away and never came back, I think we need to get real about them. I think we need to treat them as unbelievers and try to convert them. I think we need to take away any kind of starry-eyed, well, they made a profession when they were 6, so if they die tonight, I guess, they're in God's hands. I think they're in God's hands, but not in a good way. We need to get real about those people. But I think if you made a profession when you were very young, even if you went away for a while, I think the fact that you returned is probably evidence that your conversion was genuine. And so I don't think we need to do that Southern Baptist game where they baptize everybody like 17 times over the course of their life. That makes us feel good about our baptism numbers, but I'm not sure we're doing anything, right? It's kind of a hamster wheel, And so I think if you were baptized when you were very young, kind of went off your own way and came back, I don't think you need to be rebaptized. There are also a lot of people talk about like if they were baptized in other denominations, do they need to be baptized again? I don't think so. I think, the Lord works outside of our denomination, right? I'm Southern Baptist for a reason, and yet if you were baptized as a Presbyterian, or you were baptized as a Catholic, or you were baptized as like an Episcopalian or something, I don't think you need to get rebaptized. Now, if you were baptized as an infant, I would say what you need to get is baptized, because I don't think that baptizing an infant really counts. An infant cannot make a profession of faith. They don't know you exist when they don't see you, right? So, they don't have object permanence. So I'm fairly confident in saying that an infant can't be baptized as a profession of faith, right? And so if it was like an infant baptism type thing, then yeah, I would say you should be rebaptized. But if it was just that you were a young kid, I don't think you need to. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, but I'm saying, do you think I should encourage them? They've mentioned it. And
sure. Yeah.
I hadn't discouraged, but at the same time, I want to say, why do you think you need, why do you think, I want to. Yeah.
I would say, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, it's just they believe, and that's simple.
I think if they believe, they can be baptized. Now, so I would say you should encourage them. You should not encourage them.
No,
right?
That's what I tried to be.
So I think you're probably doing exactly the right thing. There's another Baptist game, right, where it's like, our kids are 8. They ain't been baptized yet. What are people going to say, right? So you're like, you start kind of dropping the hammer on them about getting baptized, and that I think a lot of times, unfortunately, fuels a lot of false conversions. You get a lot of coached testimonies where it's clear the kids are just kind of saying some things their parents had to memorize. But I think what you're doing, it sounds like, is probably exactly right. It's good to encourage them that if they believe, then they can be baptized and should. But you're right. It's one of those things that they need to come to that conclusion themselves. And so you can steer them rather than push them, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So that's a very long-winded way of saying it. It sounds like you're on the right track. Well, one last question. How will your life be different now that you have read and wrestled with this passage? I need to let you go home.
Get baptized.
Yeah. So I will be baptized. That's good, yeah.
I will encourage my children to talk to Ryan about baptism.
I will encourage my children.
You don't have to write that.
Well, and I think it just confirms to us that, because a lot of people will say, I don't need to be baptized, I can be a Christian without being baptized.
Yeah.
But looking at it tonight and hearing what you're saying and what everybody else is saying, it's confirming for me that we do need to be baptized. That doesn't mean we can't be saved, but we need that piece of it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think in that there's just the broader issue. There's a very broad issue with the sentence, I can be a Christian without blank, right? You hear it, I can be a Christian without being baptized. You hear, I can be a Christian without going to church. The list goes on, right? You can be married without going home, but your marriage isn't going to last long if you don't go home, right? I can be married without going home and seeing my wife, but if I never go home and see my wife, eventually she's going to get an annulment, right? And so I can be Christian without blank is just, nothing good ever follows the blank. Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of people use the thief on the cross.
Sure. Yeah. That's true. Yes, the thief on the cross was never baptized. The thief on the cross never went to church a day in his life. The thief on the cross never did this or that or whatever else. And yet, if you're getting crucified and then you convert, okay, then you have an out, but that's it, right? Yeah, that's good. Well, would anybody like to pray so that I'll stop holding you hostage?
I will.
Okay.
Father, thank you again for the opportunity to be in your house and go over your word and learn more about it, Father. I pray for the ones, Father, that were mentioned tonight, you touch and heal them if it be thy will. Father, I pray for the lost that they would come to know you, Father, as their Lord and Savior. Be with us, Father, in all we do, and just let it be good, Father. Ask these things in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. All right. If Lane hadn't volunteered to pray, y'all might have died here. Might have grown to a ripe old age.